Hey there, everybody! Welcome back to the Only Podcast. Post seasons edition, the first one. I'm Chris Vanini, your host, as always, joined by former TheOnlyColors.com managing editor Joe Toohey, who has transitioned now to a basically a podcast only and write when you got a chance role. We have a new manager at the site. You've probably, if you've been on the site, you've probably seen him writing some stuff, getting a lot of stuff up. So we got a number of things to talk about today. I wasn't sure when we were going to do another one of these podcasts after the basketball season ended, but a bevy of news this week has, I think, resulted in the need for one. So, Joe, how are you doing? And could you speak for a moment on the new leadership at the Only Colors?
Yeah, I think Dom Garrett, who's the new managing editor, will do a good job. He's very experienced with social media, so I expect that there will be a more cohesive social media strategy than me trolling or reacting to trolls on Twitter. So you have that to look forward to. Yeah, I think he's got the sort of energy to do it going forward. So I'm excited for that and to kind of just write when I want to, which should be fun.
Yeah, and you had a reason to this week, and we'll touch on a couple things in this podcast. We'll talk about the basketball transfers and recruiting and kind of the state of the roster there. We'll talk about Tom Anastas coming back for a sixth season, and we'll hit some football at the end with some recruiting and maybe depth chart, depending on depending on how long this goes, because we usually end up going longer than we expect. But yeah, Joe, you wrote about Marvin Clark because this week both Marvin Clark and Javon Bess announced that they intend to transfer out of the Michigan State basketball program. Javon Bess was one I think a lot of people expected. Marvin Clark, though, kind of was a surprise. He was in the doghouse for his share of time during the 2 years at MSU. He brought a lot of offensive skill, but I think the defense and the rebounding were big for Izzo. But toward the end of the year, he had moved his way back into the rotation, but he clearly wants to move somewhere else to get playing time. And with the touted freshman coming in, he didn't see his playing time going up. So, I mean, what were your thoughts on Clark and Bess and the guys that are leaving the program?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I think Bess was not surprising. Marvin Clark was somewhat surprising, though not a bombshell by any means. What's interesting to me about this is that clearly I think Marvin Clark realized that he was going to be not gaining playing time next year just because Miles Bridges is almost certain to be a power forward given his size and ability, and Kenny Goins was a Tom Izzo favorite to some degree. So that was, I think, the sort of the death knell of his time at Michigan State. What's really interesting to me is that I think Marvin Clark's one of the better, if not the best, player to transfer away from MSU that did so because of playing time. Now, I think that there have been a lot of good players that got dismissed or could have been good players if not for off the court issues. But right. I think Marvin Clark is a chance to do it. What ended up happening with some guys, including Brandon Cotton, who was a McDonald's All-American, ended up transferring and having a very good career at the University of Detroit, is that they had very good careers after they transferred, but at MSU they were either not very good players or very mediocre players. Marvin Clark's probably the best player during his time at MSU to transfer away from MSU. So due to playing time, and I'll leave it at that. So the secondary.
Well, do you mean best player at the time or when their career is done? Because you wrote the story, you wrote the bit on right. On the win shares, and obviously Clark's don't include anything. Don't include anything he will be doing going forward yet.
I think probably at the time of the transfer, just because I mean you can't really compare Marvin Clark to Brandon Cotton, for instance, yet. Depending on where Marvin
Right.
Clark goes and how he ends up contributing, he could end up having a better career, or maybe a slightly worse career, just because of the player that he is. I don't think he's ever going to be a dominant, ball control kind of player. But
Yeah, I mean, some of the other people left for playing time that you had in your piece: Doug Davis, Brandon Cotton, Maurice Joseph, Tom Herzog, who was a senior, maybe a grad transfer, Garrick Sherman, Brandon Kearney, and kind of Russell Bird. I think the only Maurice Joseph's an interesting one because he, kind of had a good amount of playing time. At least he was in the mix that his last year there. And then Garrick Sherman, who had a number of starts in his career, went on to finish up a decent job at Notre Dame. Maurice Joseph stands out for his win share total win shares of 7.0, and Brandon Cotton's was 7.1 because, like you said, Joseph helped Vermont get to the tournament. Cotton went to Detroit and did pretty good. So we need to see how Clark finishes his career.
Right, and so, I mean, sort of the secondary conclusion to take away from that analysis that I didn't put in the piece is that if you've got a player as good as Marvin Clark looking around at the roster and saying, hey, I'm not going to get enough playing time, as much playing time as I want, that means that your roster's in pretty good shape, right? If, he's not going to make that decision just because, and so, the positive takeaway there is that MSU's roster is in such a shape that a guy like Marvin Clark can see, oh, Javon Bess is transferring as well, but I'm still not going to get the time that I might want. That's a good place to have your roster be.
Right, and you also point out Clark's total win shares so far are 2.8, which is more than at MSU. Brandon Cotton was 0, Maurice Joseph was 1.0, Doug Davis was 1.3 total. So yeah, and you called him a poor man's Raymar Morgan, and he sort of was. He kind of struggled to find that role. The MSU power forwards who shoot threes have, other than like Draymond Green, they've struggled to fit in the right role. Kenny Kaminsky transferred out, or he was dismissed. I mean, but he too was a guy who was maybe an offense scorer, outside scorer before or anything else. That's kind of what Marvin Clark is, and it's difficult kind of to fit in Izzo's system like that. And Clark, for those of you who don't know, had a very difficult upbringing, overcame a lot to get to where he is at MSU, and certainly everybody wishes him the best elsewhere. He played some high school ball with Lou Rawls and Aaron, and they were close. So it'll be interesting to see where he goes because he's got 2 years of eligibility left. He hadn't redshirted, so he can sit out a year and not lose that. But he certainly has the skills to help somebody, especially offensively. We know that. Bess was a guy who was actually a starter at the beginning of this season. People had a lot of hopes for him. He battled injuries his freshman year last year. I think a lot of people probably regretted that he didn't use a red shirt in hindsight, knowing all the injuries he had to deal with. Kind of pretty much had a wasted year, but he had good rebounding for his size when he was in, but this year it just didn't translate. So you've got two guys who, instead of being maybe veteran bench guys, have decided to try to go elsewhere. I don't think you can really, you can never blame a player for wanting to leave and get more playing time. Izzo, by all accounts, was expecting some of these departures, so it's not a surprise. And he says he's going to do what he can to help. To help them.
The other interesting thing about Javon Bess was how complimentary Tom Izzo was of him during the offseason. I mean, he compared him favorably to Draymond Green in some respects. Said that he was had some of the same skill sets. So that's pretty high praise from Tom Izzo, and so that was a little bit of a disappointment to see that he was unable to kind of be that stretch four. There was a clear point during the season where they kind of took him away from playing power forward and played him more on the perimeter, and that put him behind a number of guys because there's a lot more depth on the perimeter. So Javon Bess was a little bit less surprising, and I also wrote, and I think that this is true, that he's got a pretty high upside for a smaller program, just given that his size won't be as much of a disadvantage for him in a league that's a little bit less challenging than the Big Ten, I think. So
Yeah, and so what that does is that opens two more. That the two of them open two scholarships. MSU lost 3 seniors, and they have so now they lost 5 guys. They have 4 guys coming in. Kenny Goins was given a scholarship before the season. Presumably, this means he will keep that, especially with the way he played. I think he obviously deserved that. So obviously, where people look to now is Josh Jackson, the #1 overall recruit, who people point to. MSU didn't have a scholarship for him unless either Deontay Davis left or someone else had left the program. 2 people have left the program. Deontay Davis may leave the program, may go pro, could open a second scholarship. But with Jackson, there were rumors about a week ago that he was about to commit to Kansas. That didn't happen. There have been rumors recently that it's Arizona, but he's holding off on when he's going to announce. I believe it's in April. I don't remember the date. But where do you? I know there's a lot of rumors going around, but where do you think? Do you think MSU has a chance with him? Because I'm leaning, based on the comments I've seen, the rumors. It appears to me that MSU has very little shot. Jackson says he's already made up his mind. He does not sound like someone who is going to pick Michigan State. So what do you think?
So just to clarify, the date that he set for announcing, I believe, is April 9th. Okay. So there's a couple weeks here. So as far as MSU's chances for landing Jackson, it does seem like the timing is somewhat positive for MSU. The fact that he held off on announcing his decision, and then all of a sudden there's a scholarship available, on its surface makes it seem like that timing is somewhat favorable for MSU. Now, that is absolutely meaningless overall. So, yeah, it's a tough thing. There's positives for MSU in that Josh Jackson, growing up, had a lot of connections to some of the other guys who were in this freshman class: Cassius Winston, Josh Langford, Miles Bridges. And so the more time that you give the guys who are already committed, who already have their letters of intent signed to, try to make the case for MSU, and now that there is the spot open, that seems positive. So I don't know. And MSU's been in the mix the whole time. It's not like they came out of nowhere or anything like that. Right. So I think there's I don't know, if I had to put a number on it, I would guess maybe a 25% chance. It's definitely not likely, but there's a pretty significant shot.
Yeah, there haven't been many rumors or much of any talk indicating that MSU is the pick. Now, MSU's been on the end where they think they're getting the guy and he ends up somewhere else. So possible things to change, but it does not appear likely at this point. In which case, do you think they would? I mean, I don't know the people who are available, but do you think MSU could look toward either a graduate transfer or a regular transfer? It's something Izzo's done more recently than he had. Picking up Bryn Forbes from Cleveland State, Brandon Wood from Valpo. Those were guys at smaller schools looking to move up. Well, what do you think?
What's interesting about that? What's interesting about that situation is that there isn't clear playing time to be had by a grad transfer. So I'm not sure that there's going to be a ton of interest, right? So if you look at the roster, there will be plenty of bigs between Nick Ward and Gavin Schilling and Deontay Davis until he says otherwise. So there's going to be a couple bigs. Schilling will be a senior, and then a power forward, presumably Miles Bridges is there. Kenny Goins is going to be there. And then at wing, there's a glut of guys from Aaron Harris, Matt McQuaid, Alvin Ellis, Josh Langford, the freshman. There's just a bunch of guys on the wing. So there's not a ton of wing minutes to be had. And then there's Tum Tum Nairn and Cassius Winston at point guard as well. So yeah, there aren't a lot of spaces. I mean, I guess a big man, a grad transfer big man that thinks that he could supplant Schilling for some minutes might be someone that could have some interest in MSU, but otherwise it doesn't seem like there's any real glaring holes on the roster anyways. So I wouldn't think that would be like an immediate grad transfer unless Deonta Davis was to bolt for the NBA. I think in that case, sort of a non-grad transfer, a regular transfer would be a little bit more likely. But
right. Well, on the note of Davis, I'm kind of surprised we haven't heard anything yet about him. I'm sure he's going through the process, but the new NBA rule or NCAA rule, anybody can declare for the draft and pull out within 10 days after the combine in May. Someone from Purdue, I forgot, was it Hammond? I don't remember. Someone from Purdue did. A number of guys. John Calipari announced that the entire Kentucky team has declared for the draft, and we'll go through the process because the new NCAA rule lets kids do that, lets them withdraw later, let them get a fair shake of where they're at. I think it's a great idea, and it was only a matter of time before something like Kentucky happened, although I didn't think it would happen that quickly. But there's nothing to lose for any of these kids to declare for the draft but not hire an agent, so they retain their eligibility. Come back and look at that. I guess Davis is probably going through the process if he wants to declare and hire an agent and go all in on that, or declare and not hire an agent yet, or decide to stay. So there's several options he could still go with. So he's got different ways to do it. And I made a comment when Clark and Best left. I said it's not good news for MSU, and some people didn't agree, said, whatever. But the issue is not next year. The issue is 2 years from now, because that depth up front will be very, very thin, because you have this coming season you have a senior Gavin Schilling, you'll have Kenny Goins, you will have Miles Bridges, and you will maybe have Deonta Davis. If Davis leaves, that gives you only 3 big men on the roster, and you may lose 2 of them the next year. Well, you'll at least lose Schilling the next year, and you may lose Bridges if he goes to the NBA after 1 year, in which case they absolutely have to recruit Big Ten starter quality big men in recruiting, or I guess get a graduate transfer. But it puts a lot of pressure on the front court for the future, and it's losing what Bess and Clark could bring as seniors, as some veteran leadership. If MSU is going down the route of bringing in these highly rated classes every year, the way Kentucky, North Carolina, and Duke do it, that puts a lot of pressure on every single year. You have to bring in those quality of classes, because if you don't, then you're going to be left with a bit of an empty roster in some spots, and that's where MSU could be hurt. Is if they only have 3 big men this year, and then only 1 guaranteed for the next year, and that'd be in Kenny Goins. It leaves them thin, and then it's down the road. It's like I said, it'll put pressure on Izzo to recruit some top quality bigs. That's what I think
absolutely
the problem is.
And also potentially, there are ways that you can kind of fill some of those spots outside of a normal recruiting process, right? I mean, you ended up with a preferred walk-on this year or next year or something like that.
Sure, but no one expected Kenny Goins. No, you're right, but no one expected Kenny Goins to be as good as he is as a preferred walk-on either. And generally, the preferred walk-on role isn't someone you expect to be starting for you. You can
but then there's
filling the spot and filling the spot with quality players, obviously, 2 different things.
Right, absolutely. yeah, the roster construction is going to be pretty interesting going forward if guys end up being as good as you think they might be, right? If Miles Bridges is a one and done, if Deonta Davis is a two and done or one and done, those specific situations present roster difficulties as you've laid out. Now, I'm pretty confident that Nick Ward, can step it up as a sophomore probably, but you're right. I don't know. To some extent, guys who are tweeners, guys who are big wings who might be able to play some power forward aren't as rare or hard to recruit probably as true big men. So that's the slot that Javon Bess and Marvin Clark were in, and I'm not particularly concerned from a depth perspective, but I just there were elements of both of their games that I liked. Javon Bess was a guy who could get to the line pretty well, and that was something that MSU doesn't do well in general. Pretty much the only thing that MSU didn't do well offensively or didn't do at an elite level last year. So, yeah, there's things about both of Bess and Clark's games that will be missed, but I don't know. It's hard for me to get too riled up about roster construction 2 years from now.
Yeah, I mean, who knows how it's going to look? I'm just saying it puts pressure on Izzo to keep up what he's done, bringing in a possible one and done, and Davis bringing in a possible one and done, and Miles Bridges, and he obviously has stepped up his recruiting in the last few years. So we'll have to see how that turns out. But yeah, and next year we kind of talked about in the last podcast how this roster shapes up. I've said it's going to be very interesting to see how much is, because a lot of these freshmen are going to be put in spots where they have to, from right off the get-go, they're going to have to. Izzo's system is very regimented, and especially for big men, it usually takes some time to get going. That's why you saw a guy like Deonta Davis pulled in an NCAA tournament game because for Colby Wallman, because of just how much it is. And it'll be real interesting to see how they adapt to Izzo, how Izzo adapts to them, because this is a little bit of uncharted territory, I think, for Izzo, since maybe 2001 might have been a comparable deal after they lost everybody. But 2 weeks after the loss to Middle Tennessee, how are you feeling about things? I have to imagine. I know Denzel Valentine says he just wants.
Not great, Chris.
Denzel Valentine just wants it to end. I imagine you are the same way. Are you at all interested in what's been going on since?
Well, I'm surprisingly still alive in my bracket contest, despite the fact that I had MSU winning it all. If I'll win my bracket pool if Syracuse beats North Carolina and Oklahoma beats Villanova. So I'm a little interested, but yeah, I mean, I definitely have been watching less of the tournament than I did, say, last year or 2 years ago, just because, it's somewhat painful to think about, and also there's not the interest level of what if one of these teams ends up playing MSU? So yeah, but that's always kind of been the case, right? Like I will say that the tournament I watched the least of was probably the 2010-2011 season, where MSU lost in the first round against UCLA.
That's what I was gonna ask you on that. It feels like this tournament has been just like lacking juice. Like there's nothing like all that interesting about it. We talk about the stupid Coach K and the Oregon player deal for 3-4 days because we have nothing to talk about. We talk about what was the latest? There was something else that just happened that we these stories that are just nothing have stretched into 2-3 days because there's nothing else to talk about in this tournament. Last year you had Kentucky going for the undefeated record. You usually have that. Kentucky's often viewed as the villain. You've got kind of a built-in story there. This year it's like North Carolina has gone under the radar, which is weird because it's North Carolina. You've got Syracuse, who makes it in as a 10, but they're not. No one's like some people say they shouldn't have gotten the tournament, but no one's like up in arms over it. And on the other side, you got Buddy Hield's a good story. He's kind of what people are gravitating toward, but Villanova is just kind of there. It just feels like there's no stories. I'm like, is it because MSU's gone and we're so used to focusing on MSU's side of things, or does it feel like there's like nothing going on in this tournament? You had a couple upsets in round one, but after that, you basically got to the power teams and you got the power teams all moving on, and it just feels like just kind of feels like there's not much going on. I'm not super looking forward to the Final Four because I don't really have any interest in anybody. I love Buddy Hield, but I think I was rooting for Virginia to win for the way that they had been knocked out the last years, but they had to go and blow it. I don't really know who I want to win. I don't feel attached to anything in the tournament. You said it's the least you've watched since then. Is it part MSU? Is it part just what's left?
Yeah, I think there's a little of both there, right? The fact that the surprise team to be in the Final Four is Syracuse takes pretty much any fun out of that there could have been. And North Carolina is a team that is not all that exciting. There could have been some intrigue in a Final Four game between two teams from the same conference in Kansas and Oklahoma. And
right, I was looking forward to that, but then you got Villanova, and it's like, meh. Yeah. You there? I don't know. Where'd you go, Joe? Joe, are you there?
Even in the non-MSU game.
Oh, you cut out for like 10 seconds.
Oh, sorry about that.
Repeat what you said.
So I was just talking about how it could have been interesting to have a conference game in the Final Four between
right.
Kansas and Oklahoma, but then that didn't happen either. And so I just don't feel like I have clear rooting interests outside of my bracket pool, and so it's just boring. There, I can't attach myself to really any particular team. I feel like I would probably want to root for Oklahoma, if not for the fact that Oklahoma is really the only other team that can challenge MSU in the combined football, basketball ratings right now.
Yeah, but Lon Kruger is awesome. Buddy Hield's awesome. I guess of everybody, either Villanova or Oklahoma, because I seem to like the people in their programs. But other than that, I don't know. I'm more interested in WrestleMania on Sunday. I'm going to be doing a podcast with the Black Shoe Diaries folks soon. So look for that if you care at all about wrestling, which I'm sure none of you listening do. But yeah, it's just kind of been a boring NCAA tournament. I can't even think of different ways to say it because it's just uninteresting. It's been a really
other than the first weekend.
Right. The first weekend, the first round, maybe the best we ever had with the upsets, with the finishes. Awesome. First weekend was great. But then you had some blowouts. You had some teams lose in weird ways like Gonzaga and Wisconsin. And those were interesting games. But like moving forward, I wasn't that into Notre Dame. I wasn't that into Syracuse. I don't know. Anything else on basketball you wanted to touch on?
Nope, that's all I got.
So, while we're recording this, the McDonald's All-American game's going on, and Miles Bridges has thrown down a nice dunk, and there's some stuff going on with some MSU players in there, so you can check that out whenever. It's already happened by the time you're listening to this. The other big news in the MSU world was hockey. And after a couple of weeks of wondering when there would be an announcement on Tom Anestis' future, via an article from Graham Couch in the Lansing State Journal, Mark Hollis says Tom Anestis is coming back, which was not met with much joy from anybody in the MSU community. Jeremy Dewar, our hockey writer, has a good piece up about it. basically Anastas has been saying, it'll take 9 years. He's heading into year 6 now. He said, based on everything, it'll take about 9 years to get MSU where it's at, and that seems ludicrous when you consider MSU's history and a lot of factors. So, yes, when Rick Comley left, he left the program not in good shape. He basically dried up all the recruiting areas, and Anastas had to kind of start over with that, which is good. But there was also some interesting stuff in this LSJ story that Anastas kept the commitments to that Comley made, which is kids who were in their mid-teens. So even though the Comley era players are out, the Comley era commits are not all out, and that falls on Anastas for not recruiting better players or choosing to recruit better players. But what really, I think, set some MSU people off is when Hollis compared it to Penn State. So Penn State's new program started just a few years ago, and they have already surpassed MSU in quality of a program. Hollis said, I feel like we've got a good system in place to build the type of student athletes you want to have here. Unfortunately, you can't do that in 5 years. Penn State had a great advantage in having no roster when it started the program and being able to build from ground zero. Tom fulfilled the commitments put out there prior to him. So that makes no sense. Penn State was a club team. They were able to bring in older players to fill out their roster, while Anastas stuck with all the young guys. That's on Anastas. Like I said, he could have chosen to bring older players. There is no way that you can spin a startup program surpassing a program with 3 national championships and a incredibly fertile recruiting ground and recruiting areas, whether it be up in Canada or whether it be all the hockey going on here in Michigan. It's a bad look. You cannot say Penn State had any sort of advantage. It did not. It literally started from the ground. And yeah, Tom Anastas didn't have great players when he took over, but he hasn't really added any good players. And the best player who was in the program, Mackenzie McEachern, decided to leave today for the St. Louis Blues, which is not surprising. But he was generally MSU's only offensive threat, and a criticism I'd had of the program is that players weren't really getting any better. Mackenzie McEachern was an example. He was drafted before he came to MSU. He's leaving after his 3rd year. He hasn't gotten much better. He left when he could, and he finally figured it was time to go. Program is not in good shape. The folks at SB Nation Hockey wrote a very scathing piece about the decision, headlined, "Michigan State officially gives up, keeps Tom Anastas. MSUAD feels really good about being the worst program in the Big Ten." And this news of Anastas comes on the same day that Wisconsin introduced Tony Granato as head coach and brought along one of the top recruiters in the country as an assistant. It's very clear Wisconsin was not happy with their last 2 years. They made a change, so they're trying to get back. Michigan State is not on the same level. I recommend you guys read Jeremy's piece on it. It's a good breakdown of things. Joe, I know you're not a big hockey guy, but based on what you've seen, you have any thoughts on hockey?
Well, 9 years is too long. That's my hot take. 9 years is too long
if Anastas knew if Anastas knew he would have 9 years, I maybe understand his recruiting platform of getting the 14 to 15-year-olds and waiting 5 years until they get there. I can't imagine he was told that. Hockey recruiting is different. You generally recruit the younger kids, but for Anastas to keep those commitments to Comley has apparently set this program back even farther. The Mun Minute pointed out, another MSU hockey blog pointed out 3 of the 5 worst seasons since Ron Mason took over the program have happened under Tom Anastas. 5 years, that's a lot. I don't know if this program's gotten any better. That's the other thing. NASA says it'll take 9 years. Through 5 years, there's no proof anything's gotten any better. And you got to remember, the Big Ten has been down the last 2 years. MSU finished second in the Big Ten last year, but the league was down. Only Michigan really was good enough to make the tournament this year. It's Wisconsin's a mess. Ohio State's not very good. Minnesota's down from what it was. Michigan's not what it was. And Penn State was a program that started from scratch, and they're adding Big Ten's adding Notre Dame in hockey now, and it appears that I don't see anything that's going to pull MSU out of the bottom of the Big Ten anytime soon, basically. And for NASA to say I think it's going to take 9 years just seems ridiculous for a program as historic as MSU, with all the history, with all the resources. It's not good. That's not good. It's not. I don't think anyone would consider that acceptable.
Yeah, I agree. That's all I got though.
Yeah, I mean, someone brought up Jackie Joseph, the softball coach, who's been around at MSU forever despite not winning much of anything. And another one is Tom Minkle, the wrestling coach, who has been around for a long time despite MSU being like one of, or if not the worst wrestling team in the Big Ten. I don't know what the money situation is, if it costs too much to buy out Anastas. I know we got an extension, a little bit of an extension recently as part of a rollover deal. But to go out there and tell people that, it'll have taken 9 years for us to get where we are, I don't think anybody would accept that. All you gotta do is look at what Wisconsin did. Their coach won a national championship. They finished in the bottom of the Big Ten 2 years in a row. Barry Alvarez makes a change, makes a big splashy hire, and on they go. While MSU is taking the patient approach with a guy with absolutely no track record. He was the CCHA commissioner, and when he got hired, at the time I wrote for the State News that it was an outside-the-box move, and that's what Hollis does. He makes outside-the-box moves. There was nothing to compare it to, and through 5 years, it just hasn't worked. And the idea that they're going to give him another year while Wisconsin makes its changes, and it sounds like Red Berenson is coming back next year for Michigan, and if he does, presumably he has one more year. And if it's between MSU and if Michigan job opens up next year, MSU will certainly be far, far below that in the pecking order of interesting jobs. So, yeah, not a good. Yeah, go ahead.
But that's an interesting point. It seems like it can't be that hard to recruit a head coach, a pretty good head coach, to be the head coach at MSU, right? I mean, it's got to be one of the more prestigious college hockey jobs out there.
MSU is the worst of the 7 Division I hockey programs in this state. MSU is the worst. They were this year. They were worse than Lake State. They were worse than Northern. They were worse than Tech. They were worse than Ferris. You've got coaches at those schools who have done a very good job. The guy at Michigan Tech, who I forgot his name, but he was a Michigan assistant, and a lot of people think he might be the guy to take over at Michigan. Well, if MSU had made a change this year, they could have gone after him. There's Danton Cole running the U.S. development team, who's an MSU alum, who reportedly is apparently more interested in the Michigan job, which I think says a lot about where MSU's at. So, hockey program is down, and it does not appear to be getting better anytime soon. This year was a major step back for the program. Another three of the 5 worst seasons since Ron Mason took over have been in the last 5 under Anastas. And the roster wasn't good, but he hasn't made it that much better. And it's not like he's dominating on the recruiting trail either. Jeremy worded it as he moved MSU's recruiting from like a D to maybe a B- C+. So it's not like he's got A+ recruits coming in. It's just going to take time. Wait till they get there. They still need to get there. And then my point is, like I said, a lot of guys aren't getting much better. The guys that are getting better are are the guys who were under the radar and just jumped up on their own personally. He hasn't shown much of an ability to develop guys. So, yeah, hockey program's not in a good spot. Doesn't appear to be changing. Does not appear to be changing anytime soon. And, yeah, just another year of Tom Manassas, and could be going head-to-head with Michigan in the coaching search next year if it doesn't turn around. So this experiment by Hollis has it hasn't worked so far, but he's going to stick with it, and I think a lot of MSU folks are upset about that, but it is what it is. So moving on to, I guess, football. In a little bit of news, MSU has chosen to they have signed four-star defensive end Austin Robertson. He had some legal issues before signing day. MSU held off on actually signing him. He's got a pretrial, some sort of pretrial program or something like that he's going through. He has to go through for like, I think, a year or something like that. But MSU believes he's in the right spot to sign, and he was highly touted. Had offers from, I think, Alabama and Ohio State, to name a few. So MSU's recruiting class bumps up a little bit. They got a lot of good defensive linemen in this class. Joe, do you have any thoughts on him coming in?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know much about the legal situation in particular, but we definitely know that Mark D'Antonio is willing to give guys a second chance, and seemed to be an extremely talented defensive end, one of the top recruits, if not the top recruit in Indiana, state of Indiana, which is sort of an interesting piece. And that Austin Robertson's also a guy who is pretty clearly a defensive end, but also might have some potential at tight end, just given his build and athleticism. So potentially versatile guy, and yeah, good to have him in the fold. I mean, that was basically the only big news on signing day, was that Austin Robertson was not going to be signing at MSU. So to bring him into the fold, a little more than a month later, is good news, and yeah, it bodes well. Probably a few years from now, kind of depending on how the development with Austin works out.
Yeah, this kind of reminds, with the legal stuff, kind of reminds me of Delton Williams, who had I think some sort of drug charge, and some schools pulled out of their recruiting of him, but MSU stuck with him. Eventually, I think the charges were dropped or something, or moved on, and he ended up signing with MSU, and that's one reason when he ended up getting it. But then again, he got in more legal issues at MSU with the brandishing a firearm, but chose to stay at MSU because MSU stuck with him through that issue. So Robertson has praised MSU and Mark D'Antonio for sticking with him through this. He says, "I want, they're committed to me. I want to do the same with them." It's very thankful for D'Antonio. So it'll be interesting to see where things fall. But sometimes kids get in issues, and it's up to coaches to take the things. We've talked many times on this podcast on D'Antonio's reputation as it relates to oh, hold on one second.
As it relates to discipline.
Right. And some of it fair, some of it not fair. This situation is not going to be viewed favorably by rival fans. Not that you would expect it to, but he's been given a second chance here, and we'll see if he makes the most of it.
Speaking of Delton Williams, he's your starting fullback on the spring depth chart.
I was about to transition into that. I don't put much stock into the depth chart. Spring, it can change throughout the spring. It'll change before the fall. It doesn't include the freshmen. But it was interesting to see Delton Williams there at fullback. Not totally surprising when you've got Gerald Holmes, LJ Scott, and Maduri London as starters, although Delton Williams is also listed on the running back depth chart. Got the org starters at quarterback. Doesn't include the freshmen, and wide receiver is a spot where they're going to be big. Obviously, you've got RJ Shelton and Felton Davis. there's a lot of playing time there. Does anything stick out to you about the depth chart?
Yeah, I think at receiver, it's a very youthful depth chart. You've got both Cam Chambers and Donnie Corley on the depth chart. You've got Darrell Stewart Jr. starting at the F spot, who's a redshirt freshman, and Felton Davis, who's a true sophomore at the X position. Yeah, it's an interesting receiver depth chart. Also, Trey Kilgore is no longer on the roster, who was a receiver who should have been a junior this season, was the same class, I believe, as Jay Harris. And so turns out there's a couple recruiting classes with no receiver really to show.
Was Antonio asked about that?
About Trey Kilgore?
Yeah.
Not that I saw.
I don't see any news on him. I've been just busy. I didn't catch his spring press last week or whenever it was. But that's
no, I did not see any news on him, but he was both not on the depth chart, nor was he on the regular roster. That's just a listing of players either. So that was somewhat interesting. But yeah, there's a couple interesting positional notes. But like you said, they're probably going to change. I mean, the fact that Drake Martinez is listed as a running back, despite the fact that he was ostensibly recruited as a linebacker. You've got Gerald Owens, who was originally a running back, is a defensive tackle, although he'd been listed there before. You've got Jalen Watts-Jackson on the depth chart, which is just kind of fun. And
you should ask your roommate Blake O'Neill what he thinks of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think other than that, everything's pretty straightforward. You still got Tyler O'Connor as the backup punter. But yeah, just a lot of youth at receiver, and it's going to be, I think that's going to be one of the more interesting things to watch during the spring game, which is on April 23rd, is just to watch receiver play in general and see kind of how those guys look.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously the quarterbacks too with the two guys. But I guess between the two right now, if you had to pick one, who would you want to be the starter, or who would you think should be the starter?
If I had to choose right now, gun to my head, I would choose Tyler O'Connor, just because I think he's been in the program a little bit longer, and I like the way that he played against Ohio State in sort of a really major game with on the road, no less. I think he's just got a little bit more command at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's him until he loses it. I mean, he didn't play great against Ohio State, but he did win a game at Ohio State, so I think he deserves that until he proves maybe he doesn't deserve it. So, yeah. Anything else football you want to talk about? Anything else in life you want to talk about? How things going? How's the grad school stuff going?
I haven't started quite yet. I'll probably be starting in the fall, so got some time still. But yeah, I mean, it's been kind of nice to take a break from the blogging life.
Yeah, it takes a toll. That's for sure. So have you let's just get into whatever. Have you watched The People vs. O.J. Simpson at all?
I have not. I've heard good things, but I haven't gotten around to it.
Yeah, I guess the finale's next week. Highly recommend that show. It starts off like hilarious because of the casting with Cuba Gooding Jr. as O.J. Simpson and David Schwimmer as Rob Kardashian, John Travolta as Robert Shapiro. But I didn't know much. I mean, I knew of the trial. I kind of knew the basics of it, but I was only 4 or 5 years old at the time, so I didn't go through it live. It's been fascinating to see it from this perspective. And the show starts off funny because of the casting, but then it gets really good, and it's been pretty intense. So I recommend people watch that. What else is going on?
I don't know. Probably not too much.
I don't know.
I think we actually got a regularly lengthed podcast.
I think we're about done here. If any of you made it this far, I appreciate you listening. It's going to be, I don't know what we're going to do for the rest of the off-season podcast. We're going to have to come up with themes or something. We should have, we decided to do this today at the last minute. I would love to have Jeremy on to talk about hockey. He's not upset about that. If you want a sense for the reaction to the hockey move, take a look at the way the Michigan fans are reacting. They are in complete shock that this has happened. They know the history that MSU hockey has and cannot believe MSU has settled for the state that the program is in. But I don't get paid to make those decisions, and a guy who's a lot smarter than me does. So that's where things are at. All right.
Yeah, I have no hockey hot takes, unfortunately.
No. How's Blake doing? You guys hanging out
Good,
all
man.
the time now?
He ate a couple of my pizzas out of the freezer, but then he replaced them. So he replaced them. He was on the up and up about it. So this is helped him move a bed frame into his room. I don't know. It's pretty mundane roommate stuff. Like
yes, this podcast is done. Get fired up. Get fired up for WrestleMania on Sunday, people. Other than that, I got nothing else.
It's gonna be a pretty long 5 months here until football season starts, isn't it?
We need stuff to happen. Nothing. We need I don't know. We'll see.
Well, I mean, there's a big commit on April 9th, potentially.
If Frankfurt commits, then we got something to talk about. But I'm not it does not appear to be trending that way.
Yeah. And then after that, yeah, it's there's a desert of an off season with no oasis in sight. So.
All right. Well, it's 10:30. I still got work to do, and I'm tired, and I'm starting to ramble. So we'll talk to you guys next time, folks. Whenever that next time is. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll talk to you later. See ya.
Yeah.